Hey everybody, I'm excited to chat with you all today. Topic today is defining and delivering value as a product manager. Um, Thanks so much for joining. I think this is probably one of the more exciting and important parts of being a product manager. At the end of the day, the whole point of the product is to deliver value to your end user. So I'm excited to jump into this. So let's get right into it. All right, so a little bit about me. So most recently, I was on the growth team at LinkedIn, working on the network growth team. Right now, I'm actually working on some election tech, so some products to help the U.S. 2020 election. Prior to that, I was working at an ed tech company startup called Cerago. Prior to that, I was working as a software engineer and on some sales products as well, and so on and so forth. Some information about me here if you're interested, some of my hobbies and all of that. So more specifically, what have I worked on? What have I helped build over the past couple of years? So as I mentioned, I was on the LinkedIn growth team on the network growth team. So if you go to LinkedIn and that little tab next to the home button, the My Network tab, that was my baby. Worked on that for about 2.5 years, helping people on LinkedIn connect to other folks on LinkedIn and discover the events and interests and all those things that will help them build their network. And also some of the other screenshots on here are some of the ed tech products I worked on, some sales products I worked on. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. All right, so getting into the meat of today, this will be our agenda. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. But the agenda for today is, first, we're going to talk about what even is value. And we're going to start a little theoretical in the very beginning and start getting into more tactical, execution driven points. But it is important to talk about what value even is before we talk about defining and delivering it for our customers and users. Next, we're going to move into the defining value phase of the presentation, talk a little bit about value propositions, and inherent in that is articulating problem statements, and inherent in that is articulating who are we even solving these problems for. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about measuring value. Then we're going to talk about creating value. So once you've defined what the value is that your product is going to provide for your user, well, you got to actually create that value, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about just general product development cycle, the tech stack, and your team stack. I mean, essentially, the value that you drive, the value that you are proposing you will drive to your end user should determine the kind of technologies and tools that you're using on your team. Finally, we're going to talk about actually delivering value. Inherent in that is identifying risk, defining hypotheses, and coming up with a solid experimentation and delivery plan. All right. So jumping right into it, the underlying question that we should be asking ourselves as product managers, as product practitioners, is what value is my product providing for whom? I mean, at the end of the day, it is really that succinct. We can, of course, break this down into multiple pieces, but as product people, we should be thinking about this pretty much constantly. What is the actual value that this specific feature is providing? Or like, what is the specific value that we're aiming to deliver in the sprint, for example, right? Or if you're doing quarterly planning and you're scrambling to put things together for your roadmap, underlying all that is like, why are we even building this thing, right? What's the value we're trying to provide? And specifically for who, who is this value? Who is this value for? And what, what segments of who are we providing this value for? All right. So as we mentioned, we're going to start a little theoretical at first. What even is value, right? When we talk about this definition of value throughout this whole presentation, or just colloquially when we're talking about it, what is value? So breaking down a couple of definitions here, this is more on an economic spectrum of how we consider what we consider to be value. So there's things like intrinsic value, right? So the product itself has the product or the good or the service has value that's intrinsic to itself. So the first thing that may come to mind is something like gold, right? Like the actual element itself, the actual commodity itself has value. It's like very conductive, has some actual use. Then there's value that's determined by labor. So specifically the amount of social labor required to produce it means it's valuable, right? So you actually build a product, you've put in this labor into it. Then there's this idea of exchange value. Can this product be exchanged? Can this good be exchanged? I found this diagram on the right to be really interesting. Just our general human history of how we created value and made money has changed drastically, mostly for the better over time, right? Initially used to be very one-to-one. You as a craftsman would create something and that creates value directly. Now we're moving more into this flexible definition of value, which leads us to this more particular definition of value other than those ones that we just mentioned, which is a subjective theory of value. So without going too much into it, this concept of value is more along the lines of what we'll be talking about today, which is that a value of a good or product is not determined by some kind of inherent property of the good, but more about the importance that individuals and users place on that particular good or product on the achievement of their goals or desires. So this is where we're going to be focusing a lot today, is this concept of an individual, whether they be a product user or a customer, or just conceptually thinking about this in, like the day-to-day. There is a particular goal that an individual has. There's particular desires that individuals have, and whatever product, good, or service that allows them to achieve that goal or desire is valuable to them, and it is subjective. So this is where we start leaning more into like usability, UX, and things like that. If you look on this diagram, you have your user goals, but at the very outer edges, it's behaviors, motivations, needs, and then drilling down into user types, and then drilling down into user goals. So this is the model we'll be working with, subjective theory of value. So moving forward, when we talk about value, just think of this definition. All right. So moving into defining value, not defining value in the sense of definitional, but what does it mean to define value for a user when they use our product? The key questions we have to ask ourselves are, what value is my org? And then drilling down, my team, my specific product providing. Who is this value for? Who even are my users and customers? What problem is my product solving for them? And then diving into the idea of a value proposition, which is essentially at its core benefit in exchange for cost. And that cost could be monetary if you're B2B, but it's also your time, right? As a user, you're spending time on apps and spending time on your product. That's a cost. All right, so what is a value proposition? Basically, as we just mentioned, it's if you spend this time and this cost, whether it be time or money, you get this benefit. And I like this definition. Believe it's from that Business Canvas, the famous Business Canvas book. I forget what it's called off the top of my head right now, but it puts it really simply where it's like, if the user takes it, actually uses the product, then you provided them value. If they don't use your product, as in if they don't take this proposition, then you fail to provide them value. Pretty simple, right? And so moving into some examples here, a good value proposition explains exactly what this trade-off, or not this trade-off, but this like exchange is. So it's like, what do I get as a user? What value do I get in exchange for my time, in exchange for whatever cost. So Stripe here on the left states that they're the new standard for online payments. They're the best software for running an internet business. So for me, the value proposition there is that if I, as an internet business, would like the payment software, then I can exchange basically exchange money in return for this service. So this is getting a little too theoretical, but this is more to illustrate that when you look on different websites, or if you look on different landing pages for products, what they're trying to do at the end of the day is explain what their value proposition is. So just some examples here. All right, so drilling down a little bit deeper, if we simplify the formula or equation a little bit more, the way that I personally see it is that value at the end of the day is some kind of problem or need solved for some group of people. Like, to me, when I think about this general concept of defining and delivering value, if I could just strip it down to several words, this is what I think about. It really, at the end of the day, is like, is there an actual problem? Is there an actual need that is being solved for people who actually have that problem or need, right? And if you are doing that, you're driving value. It's as simple as that at the end of the day. So then let's start being a little bit more specific and use examples here. So the question that you should be asking yourself as a product manager, product practitioner, is what problem is this solving? I'll be the first to say that this isn't always the easiest thing to do. I mean, that's part of why I like giving this presentation, is because it's like a reminder to myself in a lot of ways. Some days you'll be caught up in the day-to-day of execution. You'll be, most of your time will be spent on, like conducting alignment meetings or planning ahead for the quarter. Your team may have these OKRs that you need to hit. And to step back and really ask yourself, what problem are we solving, is so important. It's just good as a reminder. I think the sub point of that is, are we solving for a real need, right? And so this requires a nice combination of critical thinking, but also a lot of honesty on your part and then the part of your whole team. It's like, are we really solving for a real need here when as we're scheduling out the next sprint, or then we're literally putting pen to paper and like scheduling out these tickets and writing these specs and all these things, right? Is there a real need that we're solving for? So at LinkedIn, we had a really great vision. I think it's a really admirable vision to create economic opportunity for every member in the global workforce. So using an example, let's talk about what a real need would be in this situation, right? So I think the most straightforward example we use with LinkedIn is the jobs platform. So if we break it down into a who, and then a need, and then value kind of framework. So who is LinkedIn members or anyone that comes to LinkedIn? The need, which is a very real need, going back to this, like, hey, are we solving for a very real need here, is finding a job, getting connected to that economic opportunity. And then the value we'd be delivering is getting hired for that individual to get economic opportunity after getting a job. So yeah, I think the summary here is just continually asking yourself, what problem are we actually solving? And then, is that problem a real need? So just following up on that, more tactically speaking, because I think it's great to have theory, but one of the main goals of this talk is to have tactical takeaways. And so it's always good to have like a template, almost like a Mad Lib style, of how to create a good problem statement. So yeah, it really is like who, and then need, and then what's the value. This template on the right adds the extra step of adding insight, which is always good. It's like, because of some insight that we have, some data from a previous experiment, things like that, we have additional evidence that supports this problem statement. So a good problem statement focuses and frames the problem and empowers you and your team to make decisions. All right, so jumping into so we talked a little bit about the problem part, right? So let's dig into the for who part, because this is where the real meat of it comes in. Because if we're talking about delivering value for end users and customers, it's really important that we are precise about who. It's a fairly easy trap to fall into to say the value that we're driving is for everybody, right? So at LinkedIn, saying, "Oh, this feature will help every LinkedIn member," period, right? And that's seldom the case. And this is where segmentation becomes really important. Simply put, segmentation is a way to cut and slice and dice groups of users and like a user base. More specifically, it's used to identify behaviors of individuals and allows you to put and classify people into related groups. So over here on the right is what we call like the classic. I've heard it be called like the classic OG base segmentation. You'll find this on any like analytics platform, right? The ability to cut across these 4 main dimensions, where that'd be like your geo. So it's like region, countryside, things like that. Demographic, whether that be, it says here age and gender. That's, we anonymize that usually, but demographic. So it's like, what type of groups are you part of? Psychographic, which is more about lifestyle, social class, things like that, and then behavioral. So this is great. This is like a nice baseline to start with when you start segmenting users and people. But a more impactful model is what we call the jobs to be done model. So specifically, it's asking yourself, what's the actual job and what's the actual thing that the user is trying to accomplish? So job is essentially shorthand for what an individual really seeks to accomplish in a given circumstance. So we don't have to get too deep into this. Highly recommend just Googling jobs to be done model. It's pretty well known at this point. I think Clayton Christensen was the one who coined it initially, but it breaks down even further into things like the main job, related jobs, functional jobs, emotional jobs, etc. So definitely check it out. And continuing on, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, hey, what are they actually trying to do? So being able to segment down by these desired outcomes rather than just like geo, right? Rather than segmenting your user base by people in the US who are who live in this area. Like, that's great. But what you really want to be doing when you're thinking about this framework of defining value and delivering value is thinking about what are your users actually trying to do. One of the more famous images is this thing on the right with the skateboard. You've probably seen this. It's used in a lot of different articles. But the customers buy these products, like the actual skateboard. What they actually want to do is do a kickflip. They want to look cool, right? So really focusing on what your users and customers actually want, the actual jobs they're trying to achieve, the actual things they're trying to accomplish, will help with segmentation. And of course, when we're talking about segmentation, we're talking about defining value, we have to talk about measuring value. So it's great that we can identify all these individual like jobs to be done and segments, but we need to be able to measure value from those jobs being done from these different segments. So this is a pretty key part of defining and delivering value. So your success metrics should capture the value prop that you're proposing. At the really upfront, it's just asking, what does success look like? You should do this as early as possible, because this will be pretty important in driving the rest of the value creation flow and delivery flow. This is one framework, the game metric framework. There's so many, right? Part of this slide is just to say we do need a way to define success and capture define metrics. But as you all know, like you could have a whole presentation on just that, right? Like product school actually has a lot of really good presentations on that. But just one framework of thinking about this, one framework out of many, is that identifying what goals, what value you're trying to achieve, deliver, defining the actions that matter. That's the A part of this. And when we talk about actions that matter, like if we talk about it on the like actual nitty gritty level, we're talking about what tracking events are you going to need to fire, right? Like what are the control interactions you need to add on certain buttons or certain scrolling behavior, things like that. That's why actions, identifying the actions that matter is super important here. Once you've identified that, how are you actually going to define the metric, right? Like what kind of metric is it going to be? How are you going to actually measure it? And then setting up a framework for evaluating your metrics afterwards. This is from Hacker Noon. I think just search Hacker Noon game metrics. And it's a great article by Vince Law. He's a good friend of mine, mentor of mine. And another really good way to think about metrics in the M portion, when we talk about like what exactly are these metrics going to look like, you can ask yourself the following questions. Is it going to be a direct or proxy metric? Is it going to be individual versus aggregate? Is it a magnitude metric? Is it like raw numbers you're looking for? Is it a ratio? Some examples here. Is it intrinsic versus is it a heuristic, right? So as you start, I mean, up to this point, we talked about this very theoretical idea of value. We talked about potentially segmenting users by certain cuts. Now we're getting into the actual implementation, right? As we define these metrics, now we start thinking about the dashboards that we're going to create later on. We're going to think about the different analysis we're going to want to run to measure whether or not we're actually driving value for our users. So this is where the rubber hits the road, and defining your metrics are where you start getting like an actual taste of what it's going to be like to measure value. That will give you a sense of whether or not you've delivered value, and even within that, having some confidence on whether or not the results are actually showing you that you delivered value, right? So now it starts getting really, really interesting. So yeah. So let's say you've done all that. You're doing a fantastic job defining the value, defining the problem statements, defining the metrics. Now we got to actually create the value, right? So traditionally, when we talk about value creation in a business, you normally have to think through like what are the key activities and key resources, and like what's the kind of team that I have to put together. But since we're mostly talking about software here, for the most part, there's actually probably going to be a lot of hardware people here as well. But for the software side, the product development lifecycle is relatively straightforward, right? And you just have to be asking yourself, what are the critical things that we need to be doing to make sure that we're actually creating this product so that we can eventually deliver it, right? Like it's great that you can define all these things about your value and your problem statement and all that stuff, but you can't deliver anything if you're not creating it, right? And I think a really important thing to note here is that the value proposition that you laid out in the first place, the problem statement that you've laid out, directly determines the types of technology that you're going to be using. So, for example, if you are proposing that you'll create this amazing recommendation machine learning product because your problem statement is something like people need a way to discover new interests, right? Then you're gonna need machine learning engineers, right? If your product is more around providing insights from a big pool of data, then that's a big data project, a big data product, and you're gonna need engineers and a team that can support that. So the point here more is around when you're creating value, how you create the value, and the team that you're building, like your team stack, your tech stack, should all be reflective of the value that you're trying to deliver. And ideally it goes through something that's, as established as the general product development lifecycle. But of course, it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, so on to the final piece, actually delivering the value. So when we talk about value delivery, I think it's important to first start with identifying risk. So if you have too much risk, then there's a risk of your even though you've created this amazing product, you've laid out this problem statement. If you don't do this step, you might end up shooting yourself in the foot. There might have been too much risk in the first place for whether it be entering the market in the first place or shipping this product at a later stage. There may be risk. So what you're trying to do is determine feasibility, desirability, and viability of the feature or the product that you're trying to ship in the first place. So there is the idea of this like riskiest assumption test. So thinking through what's like the biggest risk to shipping your product? What's the biggest risk to creating this feature? And the way we do that is we think through hypotheses and start thinking about how we would actually design experiments in order to ship and deliver these products. So at the crux of all this is the question of like, all right, what don't you know that you want to learn, right? So an example here on the right is an experiment that we actually ran at LinkedIn. A very simple one, just to illustrate a point. We wanted to change the different designs of the discovery modules, and we didn't know how these would perform, right? So those are known unknowns. We hadn't ran an experiment with this particular set of design features. So looking over at this diagram on the right, there's obviously known knowns, things that we're certain of, but what are the known unknowns? What are the things that we don't know that we want to know? And this is where we have a hypothesis. So hypothesis here would be something like, hey, we think that if we increase the images and increase the ratio of the cover image to the main profile image, given that a lot of these individuals who have cover photos will have more information on their cover photos. If we do that, then it'll lead to more conversion, it'll lead to more click-through rate, things like that, right? That's an example of hypothesis. But as we talked about earlier, like what is the actual risk here? What is the biggest risk that we want to assess when we're delivering this product? In this case, there wasn't too much risk, but there could potentially be something like, well, if we do this, then we're actually going to risk, like the card is a lot bigger, right? So we're going to risk other cards on the page not being shown. So it's definitely a risk to call out when you're shipping and delivering a product. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's about identifying what your hypothesis is and what experiments you'd like to run based on those hypotheses. And some guidelines for hypotheses and running experiments are: you want to fail fast, you want to assess the biggest assumptions that you have, and you want to learn quickly, right? And then run an experiment again after that. You want to be able to have multiple different experiments lined up for multiple different learnings. So deriving experiments from your different hypotheses allows you to deliver value to your users more reliably and more confidently. So this is a nice issue tree of breaking out your question. So like the question you would like answered. Here the example is, why is our conversion rate instead of 10%, instead of 20%? And then there's several hypotheses, right? There's 4 already. And then from those, you can derive multiple different experiments. All right, so let's say now we've defined our experiments. We've written the code for actually delivering these experiments, delivering the code for these experiments. What do we do? Like, how does this actually, now we're getting to like the end of it, right? What do we actually do in terms of delivering the value? What is the actual ramp schedule, delivery schedule? So this varies for different teams, but this is a really good model that we had at LinkedIn called speed, risk, and quality. Speed, quality, risk, however you want to move around the letters. But the main goal is the following. So you want to be able to ramp and test experiments as quickly as possible. And that's not for the sake of speed, that's so that you can learn as quickly as possible, right? And as you're doing that, you also want to control risk. So let's say you have, using the previous example, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different experiments, right? How are we actually going to ship this? How are we actually going to deliver this so that we start collecting, so we understand what value we are driving, and then we can start adjusting and iterating, right? So in order to do that, we have six different experiments. How do we control the risk for that? And then we also want to make sure that we improve our decision quality. So this is one model of how we would potentially do this on the right, which is we ramp, we hold at about like 50%. So that's like to the population, to the segment that we had identified earlier, to 50% of them, we ramp variant A, right? And holding there, reading results, making sure that the results are, the data is sound, and it's statistically significant when we're reading, when we're drawing conclusions from it. And then from there, deciding whether or not to ramp up and ship this product and deliver value to everyone else, or actually ramping down. So when we talk about delivering value using like the inversion principle, the flip side is true too, right? Which is not delivering something that's not valuable. So let's say we ramp an experiment and it shows that this is actually pretty much like this is hurting the user experience. And we know that because we have those success metrics defined beforehand. Then we should feel comfortable de-ramping, basically de-delivering. And that in itself is a form of delivery, right? And then we learn from that. We iterate, create another experiment, and then ramp the next form of value that we're looking to ship to our users. So some sub goals here are mitigating risk, reducing damage, as I mentioned, in the case of negative impact, learning as much as possible from our users for better innovation later, using the best data possible. The data needs to be accurate. Like none of this really works if the data is not accurate. If you're not getting the right data for the success metrics that you've defined, then you're not really getting a clear signal on whether or not you're actually delivering value or not. And then having clear learning objectives, which is your hypothesis at the end of the day, and trade-offs, which is the risk assessment. You've identified what a potential trade-off could be if you were to ramp this. So that's the general, this is more of like as I mentioned, this is one way of doing this, but you want to have a plan ready for how you, like, you've done all this great work up to this point, value definition, value creation. Now you're actually in the delivery phase. You want to have a pretty nice and robust playbook for actually delivering that value to your users. And I think finally, discoverability is actually pretty key here. You want your users to be able to discover the thing that you've actually shipped, right? So on the right is the Instagram example where when they ramped stories, they made it super discoverable, like right at the very top. And then, as we all know, they have this new Reels feature, which it seems to be a top strategic priority for them. So they've made it super discoverable, both on the creator side and on the consumer side. When you create content on Instagram now, it's like the first thing that one of the first things that gets selected. When you go to the Explore tab, it's now interspersed with all the existing content that they have. So discoverability is key here. And of course, it doesn't have to be this, like this is, on the consumer side, but you can also create discoverability using training. So let's say you've shipped this new feature, you've done the whole value definition creation, all that. You want to make sure that your users are aware of the product. You can create training for them. That's another way to do it. But essentially, this discoverability is about having a degree of ease to which your users, your customers can actually encounter the feature so that they can access that value that you're proposing you will deliver to them. All right, so just to wrap this thing up, key takeaways of today. Defining your value in the first place for your product. Make sure you have clear value propositions. What problem and need are you solving for? Who are you solving for? Really break this down, like really dig into it. Like use qualitative data, use quantitative data, but really get down to understanding who you're serving. Get deeper with jobs to be done, get deeper with the actual precise actions that you'll be tracking. And what are your users really trying to do? And is it really a need, right? Like getting really honest with yourself and your team. Then creating value, the tech and the team stack that you're building should match the value that you're trying to deliver. And then when you actually deliver value, you should identify risk, you should define clear hypotheses, you should design experiments around those hypotheses, and then make sure that your product, your feature is discoverable so that the value can be delivered. So yeah, that's just a couple takeaways here. And that's it. That's the presentation. So if you would like to, actually, yeah, please get in touch. This is my Twitter handle. You can find me on LinkedIn by searching for my name. And this is my website. So yeah, thanks so much everyone for joining. Really appreciate your time.